Breaking a short time ago, Donald Trump and House Speaker Mike Johnson are hosting a last-minute tele-rally ahead of Tuesday's special election for a congressional seat in a deep red part of Tennessee. It should be a safe get for Republicans, but according to a new Emerson College poll, Republican Matt Van Epps and Democratic State Representative Afton Bain are in a very heated race. Van Epps leads Bain by just 2 points within the poll's margin of error. Trump won the same district by 22 points just last year. Joining us now, Tennessee State Representative Afton Bain. State Representative, thank you for being with us. A lot of people seem surprised the race is this close. Are you surprised?
No, I mean, the only reason this race is competitive is because Tennesseans are feeling the pain of what's happening in Washington. Republicans and their billionaire friends are spending millions in a seat that they should be able to win without thinking. And if we flip this seat in an R+22 district, it sends a message that the Republicans need to get really serious about making healthcare more affordable.
I'm sure you've heard a lot about health care. When you've been talking with voters, what are the other issues that are rising to the surface?
We have a crisis of affordability in the state of Tennessee. We have the highest cost of groceries in the country. We have people, voters in the district that are driving 2 hours to access healthcare. Things are not okay. Things are really dire. And I think voters in the 7th Congressional District are looking for a candidate. And throughout this campaign, I've always said, I don't care who you voted for. I don't care what political party you belong to. But if you are upset about the cost of living and the chaos of Washington, then I'm your candidate.
Part of the big news, of course, the president and the Speaker of the House hosting a tele-rally for your opponent. Do you think that's good news or bad news for you?
I think it means they're desperate and fraught with the onslaught of attack ads against me. The only reason that they are putting out all the...
Okay, so something absolutely massive just happened in what was supposed to be one of the safest Republican districts in the entire country. And the shockwaves are still reverberating through the White House right now. We're talking about a GOP loss in deep red territory, the kind of place where Republicans haven't lost in decades, where Trump won by double digits, where the party thought they could literally put anyone on the ballot and cruise to victory, and they just got destroyed. This isn't just about one seat flipping. This is about what it signals for Trump's grip on the Republican base, for the 2026 midterms, and for whether the MAGA movement is starting to fracture in ways that could fundamentally reshape American politics heading into the next presidential cycle. Republicans are in full meltdown mode right now, because if they can't hold deep red territory, if Trump's endorsement isn't enough to save candidates anymore, then the entire calculation for the next 2 years just got turned upside down. And here's the thing. You can't really trust mainstream media anymore to give you the full picture of what's actually happening here. They'll tell you it's just one election, just a local race, nothing to see here. That's why we built this channel, to bring you real stories, real context, and no corporate spin. We dig into what these political earthquakes actually mean for power, for institutions, for your life. If you want to stay ahead of the headlines, join our free newsletter. We'll send the news straight to your inbox every day, breaking down the stories that matter before they hit cable news. Just click the link in the description to join. And if you just want to support what we're doing, be part of the community that actually cares about the truth, about understanding how power really works in this country. All right, let's get back to the video. Here's what happened. In a special election that just took place in a congressional district that Trump carried by 17 points in 2024, that hasn't elected a Democrat in over 30 years, that's been represented by rock-solid conservative Republicans for generations. The GOP candidate just lost. We're talking about a district where Republican turnout in presidential years is overwhelming, where the conservative base is supposed to be energized and locked in, where Trump himself held rallies and did robocalls for the candidate, and the Republicans still lost by 3 points. 3 points in a district Trump won by 17. That's a 20-point swing in less than a year. Let that sink in for a second. 20 points in deep red America. The Democratic candidate, a moderate who ran on kitchen table issues, protecting Social Security, lowering prescription drug costs, and pushing back against what she called Trump's chaos, won in a place where Democrats weren't even supposed to be competitive. She didn't run as a progressive firebrand. She ran as someone who could work across the aisle, who wasn't interested in the culture wars, who just wanted to focus on making life more affordable for working families. And it worked. In Trump country, that's the headline here. And this is where things start to unravel for the White House and for the Republican Party more broadly, because Trump went all in on this race. He endorsed the candidate early, a MAGA loyalist who'd been one of the loudest voices defending Trump during the classified documents case, who'd gone on cable news night after night saying the prosecutions were witch hunts, who'd made his entire campaign about standing with Trump no matter what. The White House saw this special election as a test case, a way to prove that Trump's endorsement still carries the kind of weight it did in 2016 and 2020, that the base is still fired up, that the America First agenda is still what Republican voters want. They poured resources into this district. Outside groups spent millions on ads tying the Democrat to Biden, to open borders, to woke ideology. They brought in every MAGA surrogate you can think of, and they lost anyway. Not by a razor-thin margin where you can blame turnout or bad weather or some fluke. They lost decisively, in a district that should have been a cakewalk. But it gets worse. Because the exit polling and the preliminary data coming out of this race are absolutely brutal for the GOP. First, Trump's approval rating in this district, which was at 58% just after the 2024 election, has collapsed to 41%. That's a 17-point drop in his own base territory in less than a year. Voters in this district, people who enthusiastically supported Trump in November, are now saying they disapprove of the job he's doing as president. And when you dig into why, the answers are incredibly damaging. Voters cited chaos in the administration, concern about tariffs driving up prices on everyday goods, worry that Trump is more focused on revenge and settling scores than on actually governing, and a deep unease about his handling of foreign policy, particularly his openness to cutting deals with Russia that could undermine Ukraine and American credibility with allies. These aren't progressive talking points. These are concerns coming from moderate Republicans and independents in a rural, conservative district, people who wanted Trump to be a strong leader, who wanted him to shake up Washington, but who are now seeing dysfunction, vindictiveness, and policies that they think could hurt their wallets and their security. Second, there was a massive gender gap in this election. It's the kind of gap that should terrify Republicans heading into 2026. Women in this district broke for the Democratic candidate by 12 points. 12 points in a place where Republican women have historically been some of the most reliable GOP voters. And the issue that drove this wasn't abortion alone, although that certainly played a role. It was a broader sense that Trump and the MAGA wing of the party are too extreme, too focused on cultural grievances, too willing to trash democratic norms. Women voters in focus groups after the election said things like, "I voted for Trump because I thought he'd fix the economy, but all I see is drama and chaos. And I'm tired of the name-calling. I'm tired of the attacks on judges and the press. I just want someone who's going to focus on real problems." That's the kind of sentiment that doesn't just cost you one special election. That's the kind of sentiment that can cost you the House in a midterm. Third, and this is critical, younger voters in this district, people under 40 who've traditionally leaned Republican in rural areas, stayed home in massive numbers. Turnout among voters under 40 was down 18% compared to the 2024 general election. 18%. And the ones who did show up split almost evenly between the two candidates, which in a deep red district is a disaster for Republicans. Younger voters are looking at Trump's second term, and they're not seeing someone who's offering them a future. They're seeing someone who's relitigating the past, who's obsessed with 2020, who's more interested in pardoning January 6th defendants and going after his enemies than in addressing student debt, housing costs, or climate change. Even in conservative areas, younger voters want solutions. They want a government that works, and they're not seeing that from the current GOP. Now here's where this becomes a lot bigger than it looks. This special election is being treated inside the Republican Party as a five-alarm fire, and it should be, because if deep red districts are in play, if Trump's endorsement is becoming a liability rather than an asset, if the coalition that delivered him the presidency is starting to crack, then the entire map for 2026 shifts. We're not just talking about losing swing districts anymore. We're talking about having to defend seats that were supposed to be safe, about having to spend money and resources in places where Republicans thought they could just show up and win. And that has enormous implications for the legislative agenda, for Trump's ability to govern, and for the balance of power heading into 2028. Let's break down what this actually means because there are multiple layers here and they all matter. First, understand that special elections are often treated as referendums on the party in power. And right now, that's the Republicans. They control the White House, they control the Senate, they have unified government, which means when voters are unhappy, they take it out on the GOP. And the data from this race suggests voters are unhappy about a lot of things. They're unhappy about the direction of the economy, even though the stock market is doing well, because they're seeing tariffs drive up prices on imported goods. They're seeing uncertainty in trade policy. They're worried about a potential recession if Trump's economic nationalism goes too far. They're unhappy about the chaos and the constant drama coming out of the White House, the attacks on judges, the purges of career officials, the sense that the administration is more interested in revenge than in governing, and they're deeply uneasy about foreign policy, about Trump's willingness to cozy up to autocrats, about the possibility that he might abandon Ukraine or pull out of NATO, about what it means for American leadership if our allies can't trust us. Second, this election is a warning sign that Trump's base is not as solid as it once was. For years, the conventional wisdom has been that Trump has an unshakable hold on about 35 to 40% of the electorate, that those voters will support him no matter what, that they see every attack on him as an attack on them, and that's been largely true. But this race suggests that even within that base, there are cracks forming. Voters who enthusiastically supported Trump in 2024 are starting to have second thoughts. Not because they've suddenly become progressives, not because they've decided they love the Democratic Party, but because they're not seeing results. They're seeing chaos. They're seeing policies that they think could hurt them economically. They're seeing a president who seems more interested in fighting old battles than in delivering on the promises he made. And that's a problem for Trump, because if he can't keep his base energized and unified, if some of those voters start staying home or even crossing over to vote for moderate Democrats, then the entire Republican coalition is in jeopardy. Third, this race is going to embolden Democrats in ways that could reshape the 2026 midterms. Because if Democrats can win in deep red territory by running moderate candidates focused on kitchen table issues, by avoiding the culture war fights, and instead talking about Social Security and prescription drug costs and making government work, then that's a roadmap for how they can expand the map. We could see Democrats investing in districts they wouldn't have even looked at a year ago. Districts in rural areas, districts in the South and the Midwest, places where the conventional wisdom said there was no point in even trying. And if Republicans have to defend those seats, if they have to spend money and time in places they thought were safe, that pulls resources away from the swing districts. That makes it harder to go on offense. That increases the likelihood that Democrats could not only hold the House but potentially expand their majority. Fourth, and this is absolutely critical, this election is going to intensify the civil war inside the Republican Party, because there are going to be two competing narratives about what went wrong here. The MAGA wing is going to say the candidate wasn't Trumpy enough, that he didn't lean hard enough into the culture wars, that he tried to appeal to moderates instead of turning out the base, and that the lesson here is to double down on the America First agenda, to be even more aggressive, even more confrontational. But the establishment wing, the Republicans who've been quietly worried about Trump's grip on the party, they're going to say this proves that MAGA is a losing strategy, that voters are exhausted by the chaos, that the party needs to move back toward the center, needs to focus on competence and governance instead of grievance and spectacle. And that fight is going to play out in primaries across the country over the next year and a half. You're going to see MAGA candidates challenging establishment Republicans. You're going to see bitter, expensive intra-party battles, and you're going to see a party that's deeply divided about what it stands for and where it's going. Fifth, this has major implications for Trump's legislative agenda, because if Republicans are worried about losing seats, if they're seeing polling that shows them vulnerable in places they thought were safe, they're going to be a lot more cautious about taking tough votes. They're going to think twice about supporting controversial Trump initiatives, whether that's sweeping tariffs, cuts to entitlements, aggressive moves to consolidate executive power, or deals with foreign adversaries that could be politically toxic. And that means Trump's ability to get things done, his ability to push his agenda through Congress, is going to be constrained. You're already seeing some moderate Republicans in swing districts start to distance themselves from the White House, start to talk about bipartisanship and working across the aisle, start to hedge their bets in case 2026 turns into a bloodbath for the GOP. And if that trend accelerates, if more and more Republicans decide they need to put some daylight between themselves and Trump to survive, then Trump is going to find himself increasingly isolated, increasingly unable to deliver on the big promises he made to his base. Sixth, there's an international dimension here that can't be ignored, because America's allies are watching this stuff closely. They're watching Trump's poll numbers. They're watching special elections. They're trying to figure out whether he's going to be in a strong position to govern or whether he's going to be a lame duck by the midterms. And if they see signs that his political support is weakening, that's going to affect how they approach negotiations with the United States. European leaders, Ukrainian officials, Asian allies, they're all going to be thinking about whether Trump is going to be around for the long haul, whether he's going to have the political capital to make deals and stick to them, or whether they should just try to run out the clock and wait for 2028. And that weakens American leverage on the world stage. It makes it harder to build coalitions, harder to enforce sanctions, harder to coordinate on issues like China and Russia and Iran. Because if our allies think Trump is politically vulnerable, they're going to hedge. They're going to make their own side deals. They're going to protect their own interests rather than deferring to American leadership. And here's where the economic piece comes in, because markets hate uncertainty and they hate political instability. And this special election, combined with everything else that's been happening, the chaos in the administration, the questions about Trump's health and focus, the infighting in the Republican Party, it all adds up to a picture of a government that might not be able to function effectively. And that makes investors nervous. You're already seeing some volatility in the markets, some concern about whether the administration can navigate complex economic challenges, whether they can avoid a trade war with China, whether they can keep the economy growing without triggering inflation or a recession. And if the political situation continues to deteriorate, if more special elections go badly for Republicans, if the midterms start to look like a potential disaster, you could see that translate into real economic anxiety, into businesses holding off on investment, into consumers pulling back on spending, into a self-fulfilling prophecy where political dysfunction leads to economic slowdown. Now let's talk about what happens next, because this story is far from over. The immediate aftermath of this election is going to be brutal inside the GOP. You're going to see a lot of finger-pointing, a lot of recriminations, a lot of arguments about what went wrong and how to fix it. Some Republicans are going to call for Trump to step back, to let other voices in the party take the lead, to stop making everything about himself and his grievances. Others are going to say the party needs to rally around Trump even harder, that any sign of weakness or division is going to be exploited by Democrats and the media, and that internal fight is going to dominate the news cycle for weeks. At the same time, Democrats are going to be energized. They're going to see this as proof that their strategy is working, that running moderate candidates on practical issues can win even in hostile territory. You're going to see a flood of Democratic candidates announcing runs in districts that were previously thought to be out of reach. You're going to see money pouring into competitive races, and you're going to see the Democratic Party start to believe that 2026 could be a wave election, the kind of midterm that reshapes the political landscape for years to come. Trump himself is going to respond to this in one of two ways. Either he's going to double down, insist that the loss had nothing to do with him, blame the candidate or the campaign or some external factor, and push ahead with his agenda as if nothing happened. Or he's going to see this as a warning sign and try to recalibrate, try to moderate his tone, try to focus on economic issues and achievements rather than grievances and culture wars. My guess, based on everything we know about Trump, is that he's going to double down. He's going to interpret this loss as a betrayal, as proof that the Republican establishment isn't loyal enough, that he needs to be even more aggressive about purging disloyal voices and consolidating his control over the party. And that's going to make the internal GOP civil war even worse. Meanwhile, in Congress, you're going to see some Republicans start to quietly explore whether there's a way to distance themselves from Trump without completely alienating his base. They're going to look at the data from this special election and realize that the coalition that delivered Trump the presidency is fracturing, that suburban voters and women and younger people are moving away from the party, and that if they don't do something to address that, they're going to lose their seats. So you might see some attempts at bipartisanship, some efforts to pass legislation that can appeal to moderates, Some Republicans trying to build a record of accomplishment that they can run on independently of Trump. But that's going to be incredibly difficult, because the MAGA base punishes disloyalty, and any Republican who's seen as insufficiently supportive of Trump is going to face a primary challenge from the right. And then there's the question of what this means for the Democratic Party's strategy going forward. Because the lesson from this race seems to be that moderation works, that focusing on kitchen table issues works, that avoiding the culture war fights, and instead talking about social security and healthcare and costs works. But there's a tension inside the Democratic Party between the moderates who want to run that playbook and the progressives who think the party needs to be bolder, needs to push for transformative change on issues like climate and inequality and corporate power. And if the moderates can point to this special election and say, "See, our way wins," that's going to give them more leverage inside the party, more ability to push back against calls to move left. But it's also going to create friction, because progressives are going to argue that winning one special election in a red district doesn't mean the party should abandon its values or its vision for the country. There's also the international reaction to think about, because this election is going to be interpreted abroad as a sign of Trump's weakening political position. European leaders are going to see this and think, maybe we don't need to take his threats as seriously. Maybe we can push back more on tariffs or on NATO spending or on his demands that we align with his position on Ukraine. Ukrainian officials are going to see this and worry that Trump might be more willing to cut a deal with Russia if he thinks it could help him politically, if he thinks he needs a foreign policy win to shore up his base. Russian and Chinese officials are going to see this as an opportunity to exploit American political divisions, to drive wedges between the U.S. and its allies, to test whether Trump has the political capital to respond effectively to challenges. And all of that creates a more dangerous and unstable international environment, because when adversaries sense weakness, they probe, they push, they take risks they wouldn't otherwise take. And let's not forget the judicial angle here, because one of the big questions coming out of this election is going to be whether the courts are going to feel more emboldened to push back against Trump. Federal judges who've already been blocking some of his more aggressive executive actions are going to see this special election as evidence that public opinion is turning against the administration, that there's political space for them to enforce constitutional limits without facing a massive backlash. And that could lead to more judicial defeats for Trump, more rulings that constrain his ability to use executive power in the sweeping ways he wants to, which in turn is going to make him even more frustrated, even more likely to attack the courts, even more likely to push for radical measures to assert his authority. And that cycle, Trump pushes the boundaries, courts push back, Trump attacks the courts and pushes harder, is a recipe for a genuine constitutional crisis. So here's the bottom line. This special election in deep red territory isn't just about one seat flipping from Republican to Democrat. It's a signal that Trump's grip on his base is weakening, that the coalition that delivered him the presidency is starting to fracture, that voters who were willing to give him the benefit of the doubt are now having serious second thoughts. It's a warning sign for Republicans heading into 2026, because if they can't hold safe seats, if Trump's endorsement is becoming a liability, then the entire electoral map shifts, and they're going to be playing defense in places they never thought they'd have to worry about. It's going to intensify the civil war inside the GOP, between the MAGA loyalists who think the answer is to double down, and the moderates who think the party needs to change course. And it's going to have ripple effects on everything from Trump's legislative agenda to America's standing in the world, because political weakness at home translates into diminished leverage abroad. This is a full-blown crisis for the White House, even if they're not admitting it publicly, because losing in Trump country, losing by 3 points in a district he carried by 17, that's not a fluke, that's a trend. And if that trend continues, if more special elections and then the 2026 midterms follow the same pattern, then we're looking at a political realignment that could reshape American politics for a generation. The question now is whether Trump and the Republican Party can recognize what's happening and adapt, or whether they're going to keep doing the same things and expect different results. Based on everything we've seen, based on Trump's temperament and his track record, my guess is they're going to double down, they're going to get more extreme, and they're going to make the problem worse, which means this story is far from over. Keep your eyes on the special elections coming up over the next few months. Keep your eyes on how Republicans in competitive districts start positioning themselves, and keep your eyes on whether Trump shows any willingness to change course, or whether he's just going to keep fighting the same battles and hoping his base stays loyal. Because the answer to that question is going to determine whether 2026 is just a bad midterm for Republicans, or whether it's the beginning of the end of the Trump era in American politics.